Helmut Marko's decision to speak openly after leaving Red Bull stands out as a revealing moment in the team's recent history. His comments reshape years of speculation about internal decision-making into a clear explanation of how authority and leadership gradually changed within a highly successful Formula One organization. Rather than sounding like a personal reaction, Marko presents his perspective as a reflective account. He explains why he believes the team's internal balance weakened over time, and why Christian Horner's departure eventually became unavoidable from his point of view. A central theme in Marko's explanation is the contrast between Red Bull Racing's original structure and how it developed after the passing of Dietrich Mateschitz. According to Marko, the team was founded as an Austrian-led project. Mateschitz held final authority, while Marko acted as his main sporting representative. Within this structure, Christian Horner's role was to manage daily operations and carry out decisions, not to redefine control or leadership boundaries. This background is important because it helps explain why Marko viewed later changes as a departure from the team's original principles, rather than a normal evolution of leadership. Marko describes Mateschitz's death in 2022 as a turning point. He suggests that long-standing safeguards were suddenly gone, creating uncertainty at the top of the organization. In such situations, leadership dynamics often shift, and Marko believes Horner sought closer alignment with Guilherme Uvidja, Red Bull's Thai co-owner. From Marko's perspective, this was more than routine communication. He interprets it as a strategic effort to move influence away from Austria and toward the Thai side of the business. Marko strengthens his account by referring to specific moments. He recalls a conversation at a gathering before the 2022 Austrian Grand Prix, where comments about Mateschitz's declining health stood out to him. Marko describes this moment as when he first sensed a broader effort to reshape the team's leadership structure once Mateschitz was no longer present. According to Marko, this effort continued over the following seasons through internal positioning and control of messaging. He repeatedly stresses that the disagreement was not personal. Instead, he frames it as an institutional dispute over who ultimately guided Red Bull Racing. For those familiar with Formula One governance, this distinction is significant. Teams operate not only as sporting competitors, but also as complex organizations, where leadership roles, accountability, and ownership interests must coexist. Marko also places events from early 2024 within this wider context. While he does not comment on the details of claims made against Horner at that time, he argues that the internal response created instability during an already demanding period. As competition intensified, internal uncertainty added pressure to technical and strategic operations. In elite motorsport, organizational disruption often affects performance before the impact becomes visible to fans. Marko also describes Horner's final period in charge as one marked by internal maneuvering. He states that incorrect statements were attributed to him, including comments about Sergio Perez and concerns related to engine development and future partnerships. These claims point to a breakdown of trust within the organization. In a team that depends on clarity and cooperation, such conditions can be damaging. Finally, Marko recalls that Max Verstappen intervened to prevent his suspension. He presents this moment as evidence of how closely sporting success and internal authority had become connected during that period. When star drivers are drawn into internal power struggles, it is usually a sign that organizational cohesion is already compromised. Marko's belief that Red Bull acted too late is one of the most consequential elements of his testimony. His conviction that Verstappen would have secured the 2025 championship had Horner been dismissed earlier reframes that season's outcome as a governance failure rather than a purely competitive one. The team's improved form after Laurent Mekies took over lends some credibility to this interpretation, suggesting that leadership clarity had an immediate operational impact. This perspective challenges the simplified idea that Christian Horner's dismissal abruptly closed a chapter of internal conflict at Red Bull. Marko's account instead reframes the situation as the endpoint of a prolonged and unresolved power struggle that had been developing quietly for years. According to his version of events, the damage was not sudden, but cumulative, with each season layering internal tension on top of competitive pressure. For seasoned observers of Formula One, this pattern is familiar. Teams that dominate for extended periods often begin to suffer not from technical stagnation, but from internal realignment struggles once the original balance of authority is disrupted. Marko is effectively arguing that Red Bull followed this historical trajectory, where sustained success masked governance fractures until performance and unity began to erode simultaneously. Marko's own departure shortly after Horner's removal fits coherently within that narrative. Rather than presenting his exit as the result of defeat or marginalization, he frames it as the natural conclusion of a role that was always tied to Dietrich Mateschitz's vision. From this viewpoint, his continued presence only made sense while that original governance structure was under threat. Once the balance of control had, in his eyes, been restored to its intended framework, his function became redundant. This interpretation casts his exit not as fallout from internal loss, but as a deliberate step away after a long-term objective had been achieved, reinforcing the idea that his loyalty was to the structure rather than to the position itself. The consequences for Red Bull as it approaches 2026 are therefore profound. With both Horner and Marko gone, the team is not simply adjusting personnel, but redefining its leadership identity at a moment of unprecedented technical upheaval. The incoming regulatory cycle will demand clarity, decisiveness, and cohesion qualities that are difficult to establish amid organizational reset. Laurent Mekies inherits an operation with enormous competitive potential, but also the burden of repairing trust after years of internal factionalism. His task is not merely to manage performance, but to stabilize governance in a way that prevents the reemergence of the dynamics Marko has described. Horner's legacy, viewed through the lens of Marko's testimony, becomes more complex and less linear. There's no disputing Horner's role in building one of the most successful teams in Formula One history. Yet, Marko's account suggests that the later stages of that success were accompanied by an expansion of influence that unsettled the team's foundational balance. Even if some contest Marko's interpretation, the existence of such a detailed counter-narrative ensures that Horner's tenure will increasingly be analyzed not only through trophies and titles, but through questions of governance, authority, and internal alignment. One of the most striking aspects of Marko's statements is their internal consistency. Across interviews and publications, he returns to the same structural themes without contradiction. The shift in power following Mateschitz's death, the alignment with alternative ownership interests, the escalation of internal maneuvering, and the cost of delayed intervention. For an informed audience, this repetition is not redundancy, but reinforcement. It suggests a coherent interpretation rather than a reactive grievance, lending his accounts a level of credibility, even among those who may dispute his conclusions. From a wider Formula One perspective, Red Bull's experience reinforces a long-standing truth about the sport. Competitive dominance is sustained not only by engineering excellence, but by disciplined governance. When internal authority becomes contested, technical brilliance alone is rarely sufficient to maintain momentum. Marko's testimony illustrates how instability at the top can gradually seep into every layer of an organization, from strategic decisions to driver management, often becoming visible only when results begin to fluctuate. The timing of these revelations further amplifies their significance.